Before we begin today's episode, an important message. This is the second in a two-part series. If you haven't watched or listened to our last episode about Dr. George Tiller, check that one out first. Today, we focus on Dr. Tiller's assassin, Scott Roeder. January 2010. It's the first day of Scott Roeder's trial for the murder of Dr. George Tiller, and the prosecutor, Nola Fulston, tells the jury this. Less than a year ago, Scott Roeder walked into a church in Wichita, Kansas, and approached a man named Dr. George Tiller, who ran an abortion clinic in town. George Tiller was standing inside the entrance, welcoming people to the morning service. The prosecutor then tells the jury, quote, "And unexpectedly, a sound was heard, described by many as the popping of a balloon." Scott Roeder had shot Dr. Tiller in front of witnesses, killing him instantly. Roeder then fled the scene. A Wichita police lieutenant later testified that the gun had been pressed against Dr. Tiller's forehead and the bullet had entered just above his right eye. Highway police intercepted Roeder a few hours later on Interstate 35. His arrest was captured on police dashcam. Grainy footage shows a white, balding man standing next to his car on the side of a highway, his arms stretched high into the air. The prosecutor, Nola Fulston, then promises the jury photos and surveillance footage as further evidence that the murder case is clear-cut. She's got receipts to show gun and ammunition purchases, as well as one from a nearby motel for the night before the killing. Roeder sits in a Kansas City courtroom, listening to these allegations and taking notes. He appears calm. Roeder is 51 years old, a divorced father of one. He doesn't deny the story being told in court that day, and he expresses zero remorse for the assassination. Despite all this, Scott Roeder pleads not guilty to first-degree murder. For months, he's been telling anyone who will listen that what he did was justified, that he was saving the lives of unborn babies. He later tells the jury, quote, "It is not man's job to take life, it's our Heavenly Father's. It's never up to man to take life, except in defense of self or others." This was the stance taken by the radical extremist wing of the anti-abortion movement in the United States during the 1990s and early 2000s, a movement that Scott Roeder was part of. In the end, the jury didn't take long to decide what it thought of his argument. After just 37 minutes deliberating, the jury agreed that Scott Roeder was indeed guilty of murdering Dr. George Tiller. Hello, my friend. I'm Aslan Pahari, and this is Assassins, the show where we tell the stories of the world's most shocking assassinations. Today, Scott Roeder, the man who murdered abortion clinic owner Dr. George Tiller. In some ways, Roeder was a lone wolf assassin, someone who was always on the fringes of anti-abortion organizations. Alone, he pulled the trigger that killed Dr. Tiller. There didn't seem to be any accomplices to the crime. But Roeder wasn't always a Christian anti-abortion extremist. So where did it all come from? It's January 2010. Scott Roeder's supporters stand outside the courthouse during his murder trial. They're holding up signs with slogans like, "Tiller killed 60,000 children." Roeder's known some of these people for years, even if they hadn't all met in person before. Mainstream anti-abortionists quickly distanced themselves from the case, saying a killing like this is never acceptable. But many of those gathered outside the court are part of a small, secretive and extremist movement whose tendrils spread across the US. These people met at abortion clinic protests and blockades, or in the comment sections of each other's blog posts. This is how Scott Roeder connected with the so-called Army of God long before he committed murder. Standing outside the courthouse during the trial is the Army of God spokesperson, the Reverend Don Spitz. Spitz has travelled from Virginia to show his support for Roeder, someone he calls a true American hero. But what is this Army of God? The US Department of Homeland Affairs describes it as a domestic underground Christian terrorist organization. It's hard to pin down who's actually a member because the Army of God says it's a leaderless resistance group. In fact, members are forbidden from telling each other about anything they might be planning to do, like bomb an abortion clinic or set fire to one, or harass and attack the medical staff who work in them. The Army of God's Reverend Don Spitz served in the Vietnam War and later became a Pentecostal minister. He was also an anti-abortion activist, often protesting outside clinics in Virginia. And at the time of Roeder's trial, he's the Army of God's webmaster. Click on the homepage of the Army of God today and you'll immediately be confronted with explicit images of dead fetuses and a series of quotes from the Bible, like this one from Genesis. "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." Scroll down a bit and you'll find a photo of Scott Roeder and also a photo of Dr. George Tiller's funeral. Scroll down even further and you'll find more glowing profiles of people doing prison time for attacks on clinics. And then some more gruesome photos and more Bible quotes. But buried amongst the hyperlinks is something important to the movement, the Army of God's manual, in which you'll find what they call, quote, 99 covert ways to stop abortion. These days, they don't offer the reader the full 99 ways to stop abortion because chapters 4, 5, and 6 have been removed for legal reasons. Legal reasons like, for example, they gave instructions for how to make a silencer. So was Scott Roeder a member of this Army of God? He's never come out and said he was, but then most members don't. His former flatmate says yes, they both saw themselves as members, which seems to be corroborated by the weekly phone calls made by the Army of God's Reverend Spitz to Scott Roeder in the lead up to the trial. So did this group give Scott Roeder the practical and ideological tools to kill Dr. George Tiller? And how was he attracted to them in the first place? It's 1992 and Scott Roeder is having money troubles. He's in his mid-30s, married with a young son, but he can't afford his car registration or to pay his taxes. Other bills are piling up too, and it's stressful. He doesn't know what to do. His money troubles don't stem from a gambling problem or wild spending. He just doesn't earn much money. Roeder's currently working as a manufacturing assemblyman. His career is full of low-paid and insecure employment. His then-wife, Lindsay, later says that when Roeder's financial troubles hit in the early 90s, everything started to change. She says that someone told him that if he didn't pay his federal taxes, he'd have enough money to make ends meet. Roeder looks into it and comes to the conclusion that taxation is unconstitutional. From there, it's a slippery slope down an anti-government rabbit hole. But at least he's found an easy way to sort out his tax bill and his car registration. He simply refuses to pay. Something else important happens at this time. Scott Roeder finds God again. He sees a famous conservative evangelist on TV and it sparks something in him. He becomes a born-again Christian. Roeder begins to read the Bible in earnest and searches out like-minded groups and people. He realizes he hasn't given much thought to abortion, but now it's all he can think about. Roeder's former wife Lindsay says that in the years after they divorced, he became more and more extreme. Flash forward to April 1996. 38-year-old Scott Roeder is pulled over by traffic police in Topeka, Kansas. They've stopped him because he has a weird number plate on his car. It's homemade and it says, quote, "Sovereign, private property, immunity declared at law, non-commercial, American." He tells the cops that he has no formal driver's license and the car isn't actually registered. He says he's a sovereign citizen, not under the control of the US government. The arresting officers have seen this kind of thing before and suspect Roeder might be a member of the anti-government Freeman movement. Earlier that year, the Freemen had an armed standoff with the FBI in a remote Montana farmhouse. The cops' intuition is right. Roeder is a member of the Freemen, but the police are also nervous. Because it's only been a year since the domestic terrorist Timothy McVeigh bombed a government building in nearby Oklahoma, killing 168 people. So the cops aren't taking any chances. They arrest Roeder and impound his car. Later, when they pry open his car boot, they find a gas mask, batteries, gunpowder, and a fuse. Everything you need to build a bomb. Roeder ends up going to jail for it. The traffic cops wonder whether Scott Roeder was planning to bomb a government department. But this time, their intuition was wrong. Years later, Roeder will explain from prison that he wasn't planning to bomb a government building. He was planning to bomb abortion clinics. It's 2010, and we're back in Kansas at Scott Roeder's trial for the murder of Dr. George Tiller. The trial lasts just a few days. After all, Roeder had admitted to killing Tiller. He just thought the murder was justified. After his conviction, the Reverend Don Spitz from the Army of God promises to keep visiting Roeder in jail. And there's good reason to believe he will keep his word, because Roeder's not the first convicted murderer to receive support from Reverend Spitz. In 1994, Paul Hill was sentenced to death in Florida for murdering abortion provider Dr. John Britton and his safety escort James Barrett. Reverend Spitz was a close friend of Paul Hill's and was his spiritual advisor while on death row. The Reverend was even with Hill when he was executed in 2003. So the Army of God has been directly linked to at least 2 murders, numerous clinic bombings, and even the kidnapping of a doctor and his wife. It's hard to know how many more there might be. After all, the Army sees itself as more of a belief system than an organization. These days, if you go to the Army of God's website, you'll see that it's being revamped. They thank people for their patience while they work on their new site. Near the bottom, they still offer a small link to the old site that the Reverend Don Spitz used to run. And in the middle of the screen is a line in all caps that says this: "Warning shot fired by Heaven's Army." So I guess we'd better watch this space. Thank you for watching, my friend. Is there a Freeman or sovereign citizen movement where you are? Let us know in the comments.